Let's not lead the French people to believe that we could grow apples, pears and other fruit without pesticides. They've always existed and always will, because there wouldn't be enough produce otherwise.
You have to realize that there's currently no totally alternative solution to using pesticides. How are we going to feed the world? Look at the statistics. If we were to farm totally pesticide-free produce today, production would fall by 40% and costs would rise by 50%.
That was the first version of the facts I was given during a program called Poison on Our Plates. The arguments put forward by my two opponents appeared sound. 2 weeks later, in Geneva, I heard another version of the facts when Olivier de Schutter, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, provided a highly critical assessment of the Green Revolution. He affirmed that, on the contrary, the whole world could only be fed via a system of agroecology.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I'm presenting this report at a time when world food prices have risen for 8 consecutive months. This crisis we're facing is not just a supply crisis, it is also a poverty crisis, a food crisis, and an ecological crisis. Non-sustainable production methods are accelerating climate change and soil degradation and are depleting freshwater resources, threatening our long-term capacity to feed the world. Among the scientific community, it has become clear we must change direction. The old recipes are obsolete. Agricultural support policies were geared towards industrial agriculture. They must now be geared towards agroecology wherever possible.
So who to believe? How to feed a world that will number 9 billion inhabitants in 2050? With or without pesticides? I read Olivier de Schutter's report and decided to embark upon a world tour. During my investigation, I aimed to discover in the field what agroecology is and how it goes against the industrial agriculture model and the Green Revolution, which have been promoted for over 50 years. I also aimed to understand why 1 billion people are suffering from hunger today. The story I'm going to tell concerns each and every one of us, as it involves the future of the planet and of humanity. The first stage of my investigation has brought me to Mexico, which is where corn originated. Born 9,000 years ago in these southern mountains, the sacred plant of the Aztecs is today the most widely grown cereal in the world. I have come to meet Eleazar and Teresa because they practice an agricultural system that was developed well before the Spanish conquest and is considered to be one of the most fully fledged agroecology models. It is called milpa and consists of sowing corn, beans, and squash simultaneously. Is it local corn?
Yes, it's traditional corn. We haven't lost the customs of our ancestors, our fathers and grandfathers.
Mira estos, Tere. Ya están bien bonitos. Voy a querer que cortes algunos para la comida. ¿No? Mira. El maíz sirve.
The corn serves as a steak for the beans.
Entonces lo que hace el frijol es.
As for the beans, They fix nitrogen from the air and supply it to the corn. The squash leaves create ground shade, keeping humidity in. With this method, we have plots that are in perfect condition and we have better results.
There are no weeds in the milpa system, because even the wild plants that grow among the crops serve many functions. Like the akawal from the sunflower family.
We don't consider them weeds. They're quite the opposite. We leave them to grow because we feed them to the animals. The animals produce organic matter and manure, which maintain soil fertility. The milpa system is a closed circuit. That's why we call it a sustainable farming model, which does not depend on the external market, but which generates its own means of production and input, using our own resources and know-how, our own seeds, workforce, and animals. This system enables us to be self-sufficient.
Agroecology is the antithesis of industrial agriculture, because agroecology, instead of being an input-based agriculture, is a process-based agriculture. So we don't depend on monocultures that require inputs of energy, pesticides, fertilizers, using a series of principles that have to do with increasing diversity, recycling, enhancing organic matter content of the soil, integration of animals, etc. For example, the milpa is a typical polyculture of Mesoamerica. But then if you go to other regions, you might find other types of crop combinations which, by interacting together, these crops provide a series of synergisms that make the system more productive than monocultures. It is believed that large-scale farms produce much more food, but actually small farms, when you measure what is called total output, are much more productive than large farms. For example, when you look at the energy efficiency of large-scale industrial systems, you will get an efficiency about 2 or 3 maximum. That means you put 1 kilocalorie of energy and you get 3 calories of energy back in terms of food. A typical small farm gets between 15 and 30. So the energy conversion is very high.
Dale Lesser farms 480 hectares of transgenic soybean and corn in the U.S. Midwest. Unlike Eleazar, his Mexican fellow farmer, he has to buy new seeds every year, as the GMOs are protected by a patent. His production costs keep rising on account of the resistance to chemical and transgenic pesticides that insects and weeds are developing.
This is transgenic corn.
This particular variety is, they call them triple stacks. They have BT for rootworms and BT for European corn borers, and then they have Roundup Ready too.
When we were in Mexico last week, we met a corn grower. He's practicing what they call milpa system. Did you hear about that?
I never heard about that.
It's a combination of plants. You are growing at the same time squash, beans, and corn.
Oh, okay, okay.
Can you imagine why it's good for...
Well, the idea is if you have more biodiversity, you'll have less problems with any one pest, I assume.
As there is great diversity of food here for insects, they affect the corn a little, the beans a little, the squash a little, and the grasses that grow in the plots. But ultimately, they never pose a problem.
The disadvantage of monoculture, of course, is that if you try to grow corn, that eventually your pests will get so bad and you have to use so many herbicides and so many insecticides that it's bad for the environment.
We don't spread anything at all on our crops. No fertilizer, no insecticide, no herbicide, and no chemicals for pest or weed control.
And as the weeds develop resistance, then you have to keep adding something else. And pretty soon you're spraying all kinds of different stuff, which you just as soon not use all that stuff, which is why some farmers use just Roundup. It's simple. It's very simple, as long as you don't have resistant weeds to Roundup.
Yeah.
So it works, the technology works, but like any of the chemicals, you always have your concerns.
For your health?
Well, for what you could be doing to your health. You know, it might not show up for 25 years or something. So,
Kids?
well, or to the consumers, or to the people who drink the water, or anything, or to the groundwater.
We are part of the earth, and we make a living from the earth, which is why we cannot pour anything onto the earth that we know will damage it. That would be like biting the hand that feeds you.
For nearly 20 years, Eleazar, the agroecology small-scale farmer from Mexico, and Dale, the large-scale cereal farmer from the U.S., who practices so-called conventional farming, in other words, chemical farming, have been competitors on the North American corn market. This is a consequence of the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement signed in 1992 between the leaders of Mexico, Canada, and the United States.
Free trade is the way of the future.
The NAFTA, which came into force on January 1, 1994, provides for the free circulation of goods and services, including farming produce, in the 3 countries of the zone. The agreement is considered as a laboratory of globalization in agriculture.
Freihandel für Landwirtschaft ist
The concept of free trade in the agricultural sector is quite simply a farce.
kategorisieren müsste. Also für die Landwirtschaft
Because in farming, there are always infringements to the rules.
diese Sonderregelungen führen im
The consequences of these infringements is that the large-scale producers, and in particular those in developed countries, largely benefit from the world market.
man profitiert von Produktionssubventionen, von Exportsubventionen,
They benefit from production grants to obtain cheap energy and cheap electricity.
billige Elektrizität. Das heißt, eigentlich wissen die
As a result, these producers are incapable of stating their real production costs or their real income.
realen Erlöse sind. Ein Großteil der Kosten, zum Beispiel
The majority of production costs, such as water pollution or vast energy consumption, are not taken into account, so the prices of their produce are totally distorted.
Preise sind verzerrt.
In 1992, David Pimentel published a study entitled Environmental and Economic Costs of Pesticide Use. For the first time, he evaluated the indirect costs that chemical agriculture generates. Among them are the death of beneficial insects, bees, birds, and frogs, contamination of water and air, and disease from pesticides caused to farmers, locals, and consumers. The study concluded that 20 years ago, the U.S. bill had already reached $10 billion a year.
The quantity of pesticides reaching the target is extremely small. Under optimal conditions, 50% of the pesticide gets into the target area. It's a terrible waste, killing birds and fish and polluting water and the public health, the number of deaths and people that end up in the hospital and so forth. It was all of those things make up that $10 billion in damages.
And how did the Pesticides Corporation react to your study?
Well, of course, the Pesticide Corporation didn't like what we published, and I know that they did write our dean and wanted me fired because of the that particular paper. And so they were unhappy with me, yes.
In 2008, a study published by the European Parliament confirmed David Pimentel's estimates. Under the leadership of Catherine Gansleben, the authors of the report drew up an estimate of health costs due to pesticide use in Europe in order to assess the savings that would be made from banning them.
We found very strong evidence of the link between cancer and a pesticide exposure. So building upon that strong evidence, we estimated that the elimination of cancer-causing pesticides from the European market could avoid 26,000 cases of cancer per year, and that this would equate to 26 billion euros per year. The health costs associated with pesticide use represent externalities. These are costs which are not incorporated into the cost that's paid by the consumer in the supermarket for a piece of fruit. If we looked at drawing in these costs into the price paid by the consumer, we can believe that the cost of food would go up.
Back to Mexico. It is precisely because the price of U.S. corn has been distorted that small-scale farmers in Mexico have been ruined today. Yet before the North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico was self-sufficient for its food, and in particular for its corn consumption, which is the nation's staple food. The government previously taxed imports and guaranteed producers a minimum price in order to support national production. These measures were abolished in the name of free trade, whereas the United States maintained their farming subsidies. As a result, Mexico today imports more than 30% of the corn it consumes, while local prices have dropped by 66%. Eleazar is a member of a farmers' organization that promotes the milpa system as a way to resist the model imposed by the NAFTA.
Everything we're eating here this evening has come from the milpa system. For us, the milpa system is intricately linked to the problem of food sovereignty.
What's the difference between food security and food sovereignty?
Food security is this basket of tortillas, for example. If we don't have the money to buy them and put them on the table, that means there's no food security. Food sovereignty is just the opposite. It's when families can produce what they consume. With the Free Trade Treaty, the NAFTA, the borders were opened up, with the result that many products, mainly corn, arrived from the U.S. at very low prices. This has created a lot of emigration, less motivation to work in farming, and so fewer farmers. Some people prefer to buy a sack of corn rather than produce it themselves, because it would just be too costly. The NAFTA has resulted in many farmers being forced to stop farming and emigrate.
Since the NAFTA, 3 million small-scale farmers have abandoned farming. And every year since it came into force, 500,000 Mexicans have traveled clandestinely to the United States. Others have migrated to Mexico's shantytowns, where they survive on the precarities of the informal economy. Like over 1 billion people in the world, they form part of the urban poor, who suffer from what the UN calls silent hunger. Today, 19 million Mexicans suffer from malnutrition. It was in this context of food crisis that Olivier de Schutter carried out an official mission in June 2011. Unfortunately, it was not possible to film his meetings with the Mexican government. For this rare occasion, the farmers' organization set up a conference entitled Hunger Doesn't Wait.
Nacional campesino con el título del Hambre no espera. Es importante que lo diga al mundo que México vive una crisis agroalimentaria, que es necesario que nuestro gobierno lo reconozca y que es necesario que la clase política y la sociedad entera tomen las medidas necesarias para superar esta situación de crisis que es inhumana.
My interest for the right to food dates from one morning I still remember. And that morning was a morning of January 2007, when the Mexicans took the streets to complain about the tortilla crisis, the prices of tortilla increasing 50% in a matter of a few weeks. And I noted that the production was above average levels, that the imports of maize were above average levels. Still, the prices climbed. And the prices climbed because a small number of very powerful companies dominating the system of distribution of maize were using their power on the market to impose these price spikes on the consumers. Cargill, Maseca Archer Daniels Midland, Minsa Arancia Corn Products, Agroinsa. So I agree with you. El hambre no espera. We need to move to policies that allow countries to feed themselves. That is what the right to food is about. And to do this, we need to protect producers from the abuse of the large commodity buyers by scaling up agroecological practices. I believe that we need to reduce the dependency of food production on fossil energies. And I believe that we need to reduce the environmental impacts of agriculture as it is predominantly practiced today.
¡Viva México! ¡Viva los campesinos!
The second stage of my investigation brings me to Malawi, a country with 15 million inhabitants, half of whom live in a state of severe poverty with a daily income of less than €1. Here, as in many southern countries, people do not always have enough to eat. According to the United Nations, malnutrition kills 24,000 people every day, including 10,000 children. The victims are, for the most part, Africans. I arrived in Malawi in December 2011. The specter of hunger was hanging over the countrysides, as the rainy season was very late in coming, as in 2005, when drought caused a severe food crisis.
Ine dzina langa ndine Christopher Katema, ndimagwira ntchito ku bungwe la ICRAF kapenanso kuti World Agroforestry Center. Mbewu iyi ndi mbewu ya Glycidia, kotero kuti pa maekala awiri ndi hafu ngati titadzala mitengo ngati iyi pakamatha zaka zitatu titha kukolola chimanga chopanda fertilizer chosachepera matani asanu. Titatsatira izi sikuzakhalanso mkatolika wakuno wogona ndi njala. Koma tsopano lino ndingofuna ndipemphe abambo Mark Majoni angofotokozako kuti kodi zimene tikunenazi zawathandiza.
Zikomo Ambuye, nanga ndine Maliko Majoni, wawo banja langa Mrs. Majoni. Timagwira ntchito yoyang'anira akaidi prison ndiye 1989 ndinapuma. Nditapuma ndalama zonse tikagulira ine fertilizer zinatha. Chocho ndinayamba kuva kuti ICRAF amadzala chimanga ndi mitengo. Chocho napita kukawafusa, nditawafusa amene wawo anabwera kuzandiphunzitsa. Pakali pano tinganire kuna kuti mukafuna kuti ndikuphunzitseni mutakubwera. Zikomo kwambiri.
In Malawi, over 75% of the population live in rural zones where agriculture is the main means of subsistence. Paradoxically, like in all third world countries, it is also in the rural zones that poverty and food insecurity is concentrated. In 2007, the government launched a vast agroforestry program which is quoted in Olivier de Schuster's report as a successful experiment of agroecology. To date, over 180,000 peasants have been trained with the support of technicians from the World Agroforestry Center.
Naturally, our soils are very low in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus, which are the major elements for crop production. So we found out that one way of improving the soil fertility is to promote agroforestry farming system.
Mark and Hilda Majoni are pioneers of the agroforestry that they have been practicing for about 20 years. They exploit a hectare of food crops, in particular corn, which is the staple food in Malawi.
Ndipo mmene titachiphere pano. Pali chimanga.
Mark and Hilda use gliricidia leaves on their field as fertilizer. They have planted the tree around their crops as well as alternating it with the corn plants. The burying procedure must be repeated 3 times a year.
The soil used to be damaged. It wasn't fertile.
We observed major changes 4 years after planting the trees. Before, we used to use chemical fertilizers, but we had problems whenever there was a drought, and the corn died. But now, since the years we've been using gliricidia, the soil quality is very good, and the corn grows despite the drought. It works very well.
It keeps the humidity in.
Could we use every kind of trees or not?
No, we cannot use every kind of trees. There are a specific type of trees called fertilizer trees. Fertilizer trees are essentially leguminous trees that can fix nitrogen. The fertilizer trees like gliricidia, like Lucina species, or like Phytoherbia or Acacia species are the ones that improve the soil fertility immediately.
The trees are more efficient than chemical fertilizer.
I used to get a maximum yield of 100 bags of maize in this field. But today, with the gliricidia, I get at least 200.
200 bags of maize per caliper.
At least a doubling or a tripling of yields occurs in those farms.
Mark and Hilda have 6 children and 7 grandchildren. Their youngest son has the job of feeding gliricidia leaves to the animals, which provide excellent fodder. In Malawi, the majority of farming families only eat once a day. The national dish is the masima, a sort of polenta cooked using cornmeal. Generally, the polenta flour runs out during what is called the hunger gap, which is the period that stretches from the end of the stalks of the latest harvest and the start of the new crop. Normally, when the climate has not gone crazy, the corn is harvested in April.
My life has changed now, as I don't have a food problem. My family eats well, and I have money.
Before, from November onwards, and sometimes even from September, our corn stocks had run out. In December, January, February and March, we suffered from hunger. But now, thanks to the gliricidia, we have enough corn. We sell it to our neighbors, and we're happy.
Some of my friends at school don't get enough to eat because their dads don't use gliricidia, and they don't get a good harvest.
My brother and I practice this type of farming in our fields. What we want for our children and our country, Malawi, is that everyone has their own trees.
Transforming lives and landscapes is the motto of the World Agroforestry Center that was founded in Nairobi in 1977. Its original mission was to stop the deforestation of tropical zones. Since then, agroforestry is booming Because this agroecology farming system, which mixes crops and trees, is sustainable for the earth. In addition, it provides a response to the effects of climate change, which will particularly affect sub-Saharan Africa, where a strong increase in arid zones has been forecast, bringing about a drop in agricultural output.
Climate change has many dimensions to it, both trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and to prevent the effects of them. Trees are very good at sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They are the champions of it, if you like. And they put that into wood products and into the soil. If we increase tree stocks in the environment, we are obviously increasing carbon stocks and taking carbon out of the atmosphere. It is the benefit of trees, and trees are fantastic.
For the researchers in Nairobi, agroforestry does not only concern the countries of the South, but also those of the North, where followers of industrial agriculture and the Green Revolution have wiped out trees from cultivated surface areas. Industrial agriculture is responsible for 14% of greenhouse gas emissions, given that it consumes so much fertilizer and chemical pesticides manufactured with petrol and gas. For agroforestry specialists, the developed countries must revise their agricultural model based on monocropping as a matter of urgency.
If trees are so useful, does it mean that the promoters of the Green Revolution didn't know about that?
Well, the Green Revolution, basically implies that food production is everything. It is the most important thing. And of course, it is extremely important. We must have enough food to feed the world. And that mono objective, that single objective, was driving the force of agriculture for the past 50 years. The big change is that society has begun to realize that agriculture is not only about food production. Agriculture actually supplies much of the water, much of the gases, the oxygen in the air. It supplies the protection of our soils and our landscapes. And, very important in Europe, it's the aesthetics, the beauty of the land. And so farmers have discounted the value of these services because society was not paying for them.
That means that the Green Revolution belongs to the past now, and we have to make a shift in our conception of what is a landscape.
Absolutely, we need to make a shift in how we value landscapes and how we can balance the need to increase food production with the need to protect our landscapes. After all, in many areas where the Green Revolution has been successful, the land is losing its value, it's losing its quality, and we have to regenerate the land. To regenerate that land, you need to change your practices. You can't continue doing the same thing year after year. And this is all about the land regeneration process, in which trees are one major way in which we can make that happen.
Changing farming practices is also the motto of Manfred Wentz and his son Friedrich, two organic farmers who run a 33-hectare farm on the edge of the Black Forest in Germany. Yet, in the early 1960s, Manfred was an ardent promoter of industrial agriculture. For 15 years, he grew his crops using large amounts of chemical pesticides.
It started in 1955, growing hybrid corn from France. At first, we didn't have any trouble with the stem borer, but after 3 or 4 years, things got progressively worse, and we started spreading insecticide by helicopter, which gave us a temporary respite.
I remember the first time we used the helicopters. People on the roadside would say, "Whatever is going on? They've gone crazy."
What was your soil like?
It was in perfect condition when I started farming in the 1950s. But 15 years later, it had become very hard and very light in color. There was no humus left. The situation was catastrophic. In 1967, we had a problem with a herbicide, simazine, which was no longer effective. I tried everything before taking the decision to stop chemical farming in 1969 and switching over to organic farming. It wasn't easy for 10 years because in my head I kept thinking conventional farming. The tilling, the hard work, moving the soil around. Then in 1980, I met Dr. Kemming, who taught me the till-free technique. He taught us to reason from the point of view of the soil. That's when we understood that a good soil should be black and not light-colored.
The 20th century was one of chemistry, especially in agriculture. But the 21st century will be one of biology. Without microbiology and a good knowledge of the soil's biological processes, we will not be able to grow crops efficiently and sustainably in the future.
Manfred and Friedrich practice what is known as no-till farming. They have not tilled their fields for the last 30 years. They never use chemical fertilizer or compost. Instead, they nourish their soil with a permanent vegetal cover considered to be a green manure. They also practice direct planting. On this day in the month of May, Friedrich is sowing soybean among the freshly cut rye and clover plants, which constitutes what is known as a mulch.
We don't till before we plant because we try to move the soil as little as possible. Every time you prepare the soil, its microbiology is disturbed. A bare soil doesn't make sense from a biological point of view. Rye produces a lot of dry matter and, by extension, carbon. Clover is a pulse that fixes nitrogen from the air. Carbon and nitrogen make up the basis of humus. These blended plants complement each other perfectly and have different functions, such as protecting the soil. The soil is protected from physical attack from rain, wind, and sun rays. Another function is that it stops transpiration, providing better water management, which is very important, particularly in dry regions.
How do your yields compare to conventionally grown soybean yields?
We get similar yields with our system. Last year, our yields were even higher. Sometimes they were a little lower. It depends on climate conditions.
The issue of yield is at the heart of studies carried out by the Rodale Institute. For 30 years, researchers there have been comparing performances of conventional and organic agriculture for the three main American crops, soy, wheat, and corn. The crops are grown on experimental plots side by side. Results show that organic farming leads to a 45% reduction in energy consumption and a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. As for yield, a report published by the Rodale Institute confirms the results obtained by Manfred and Friedrich Wenz.
Well, yields every year are just about the same, and so small that science dismisses the yields as being any different. They're the same pretty much every season, except when there's issues of drought, and that's when organic outperforms conventional crops.
Most of the time, one of the arguments of pesticide manufacturers, for instance, is that if we would shift to organic production on a large scale, we will lose 20 or 30% of yield.
It's not true, and we've proven that here. And this is not 3 years of data. I tell everybody this. It's not 3 years, it's not 5 years, it's 30 years, and we have the science. The reason is, again, back to what is the really most important thing about organic, and that's the soil.
The soil is the key. There are several ways to assess soil quality. Firstly, it has a lumpy structure. Then this soil contains a lot of roots. That's due to the fact that the rye was not artificially fed with synthetic fertilizer. And so it has had to fight to find food via its system of roots. Then, if you smell it, it smells of the forest, which is proof that the soil's microbiology is working perfectly. You can see the result if you take a clump of earth and put it into a glass of water. It does not decompose immediately because it is very firm. That's humus.
This is actually soil that was farmed conventionally for 30 years, and this soil was taken from a plot that was farmed organically for 30 years. And you can see how this soil does not hold its structure. It falls apart more easily. The water is very cloudy. Here the water is still very clean, and the soil stays more in its original structure. In the case of drought, if there was some rain early on in the season, this soil will be able to hold on to that water and store it longer for the plants to use. And then in the other case, that if we do have a heavy rainfall, then the organic soil is able to absorb that water more quickly, while the conventional soil doesn't have that capacity, and the water will most likely just run off the surface, eroding the soil, polluting ground and surface water with herbicides or whatever other pesticides were applied to that soil.
We need stable systems that don't only work under optimal conditions, but that can also respond to extreme conditions, which unfortunately are going to become increasingly frequent.
For Friedrich and Manfred, another advantage of organic farming is the financial stability their farming system guarantees. Thanks to the reduced production costs, they save 500 euros per hectare per year. These financial advantages, coupled with the erosion of conventional soils, are attracting many converts who take part in the open house organized every year in June.
In mid-May, I wouldn't have dared bring you here. It was awful. But given the climate conditions we had this winter, I'm actually rather satisfied. I think I'll be harvesting at least 3 tons of buckwheat, and I'll be able to fulfill the requirements of my clients and my baker.
I've come here because I'm having major problems with soil erosion. I hope to remedy them with this method.
It appears to work well.
Why?
Well, there are no weeds, and yet he hasn't used any chemicals.
What do you think of the buckwheat?
It looks great.
Friedrich is showing us solutions for improving our farming practice.
Is their know-how important?
Yes, very important. He's given us the bug.
It gives you hope?
Yes, a lot of hope.
What do you think are the main obstacles to mass conversion to organic farming in Germany and Europe in general?
I think the main obstacle is that energy is too cheap. The day that the price of energy goes up and conventional farmers can no longer afford chemical fertilizers, they will be forced to turn to organic farming. They won't have the choice.
Among the major obstacles to carrying out a transition to sustainable agriculture are the economic interests in maintaining the current system. They're extremely powerful economic interests. It's not in the chemical product supplier's interest to teach farmers how to do without what they manufacture and sell. States need to understand that they must work for the long-term well-being of populations and that they must not simply be at the service of interests of a few multinationals that monopolize power in agriculture today.
A report published by Hans Herren in 2008 provoked a great deal of discussion. Entitled Agriculture at a Crossroads, its drafting involved 400 international scientists under the leadership of the UN and the World Bank. Approved by 60 countries, the report concluded that the current food production system should be entirely reviewed.
What were the main conclusions? We have to really change the paradigm, move into a different direction. And where do we move towards to? We need to transition the productivistic agriculture, which is on the left side of the slide up there. And so it's unsustainable, it's highly productive. But we need to move into the other side, into an agriculture which is sustainable and highly productive too. But at the farm level, not at the crop level. We need to upgrade the status of the farmer. The farmer is looked as the lowest element in the society. No, it actually comes the first. No food, nobody. So it's time that we look up to the farmer at the same level as look to a doctor, for example. We need to make farming a job which actually pays well, which is rewarding. This paradigm change we talk about goes beyond just the field or the barn. Thank you very much. Every country needs to be in charge of its own agriculture. It has to invest in its farmers. It has to invest in its own scientists, in its own institution to support the change and the change of paradigm. It is clear that not only farmers' knowledge is important, but also science and technology. The trick here is to see how can we marry basically these innovations with the farmers' knowledge. And we have now to catch up almost 50 years of missed opportunity in research for sustainable agriculture.
Ginyinga an John ukelo tiep ne joma ok ong'eya. Arwako uwe farm na be kama wabiro puonjore gigo matin ma wanyalo neno. Jathurwa moro kotelo loka kocha to wacho ni yes we can. I'm saying that we can. With the push-pull, we can.
Push-pull is a technology where you don't have to apply any pesticide, any fertilizer, any herbicide. Still, you can increase the yield and increase soil fertility. And I would like to see at least 1 million people here to adopt it. If there are 10 people in a family, you can see 10 million people to be food secure immediately in this country.
Dr. Zair Khan is an Indian entomologist who started his career in the United States before joining the ISEPR, an international center for research on insects financed by private and state funds. He is the inventor of an agroecology technique for which he has received numerous academic awards. Called push-pull, it helps fight parasites that attack corn, which, as in Malawi, is the staple food.
When I came to Africa in 1993, I saw the problem of small-scale farmers, and it was stem borers, striga, and low soil fertility. The striga alone can cause 7 to 13 billion US dollar loss annually.
This is what we call striga weed. The striga weed, it is a parasitic weed. It is growing and taking its food from the roots of the maize. This is the type of maize that we could get from our farm. So we work very hard, but we cannot get enough food for our home consumption.
John's other enemy is this little moth, which is the principal corn pest. The stem borer lays its eggs on the leaves of the plant. The larvae then turn into caterpillars, which burrow right into the stalks, causing a major drop in yield. In Africa, losses due to this terrible moth are estimated at 10 billion euros. It was to fight the stem borer that the US firm Monsanto invented their Mon 810, a transgenic corn manipulated to permanently secrete an insecticide substance.
I did not come up with the push-pull technology immediately. It took me a very long time to think about one technique which could solve all these problems. And it took a lot of research, understanding the plant-insect communication, plant-plant communication, and how to carefully choose the plants which could do this job, pulling and pushing the insect, and also controlling the striga, but also in improving the soil fertility. We also worked with the farmers very closely from the start of the project and selected the plant which were of economic benefit to the farmer.
John and his wife Perez run a 2-hectare farm. They adopted the push-pull technique in 2008. 3 years later, they have completely eliminated both the striga weed and the stem borer, and have totally given up using chemical fertilizers and pesticides, as well as the GMOs that Monsanto is trying to introduce into Kenya. The method of biological control invented by Dr. Khan is based on the action of 2 plants, Desmodium and Napier grass, which he selected among 600 African plant species.
Before, this garden was producing very small ones. From 1 acre, we have been getting 2 bags of 90 kg. The yield has gone up from 2 bags a acre to 22 to 24 bags a acre. This plant is called Desmodium. It is suppressing the growth of striga weed. It adds nitrogen to the soil. And you see how it is now covering the soil. So it also helps us to control soil erosion. This Desmodium also is a repellent to that thing we call stem borer, which is affecting our crops. So this thing has a smell. The stem borer, when they smell the Desmodium, they run away, they go to the Napier grass. The Napier grass is planted around the plot of maize. So it is now pulling the stem borer, which is pushed by the desmodium. The stem borer likes the napier grass. The napier grass has a sticky substance that when it lays the eggs there, the larva will be staked on the leaves of the napier grass. So they will die there. It is why we are calling this technology push-pull.
One of the arguments of the pesticides manufacturer is that agroecology, because push-pull technology is one agroecological method of pest control, is just coming back to the Stone Age. What do you answer to this argument?
It is not a Stone Age technology. It is a highly scientific-based technology where we understand the chemistry of the plant, and push-pull is now taught throughout the world, from China to America, in the United States, in the graduate courses, as an example of a highly scientific agroecological technique. The farmers who are using the push-pull system seem to be more understanding the farming system, and they are smarter. They do the agriculture in a better way than the farmers who just buy a bottle of pesticide and apply.
The push-pull technique has enabled John and Perez to diversify their farm produce. They have extended their goat and dairy cow herd, to which they feed napier grass and desmodium. As a result of this protein-rich fodder, milk productivity has increased threefold. The couple have had a new house built to house their large family. They call it the push-pull house. Perez harvests the desmodium seeds, which she sells to new push-pull converts. To date, 50,000 Kenyan farmers have adopted the technique. The family is now self-sufficient and also makes a substantial income from corn production.
18. Before we start push-pull, we had no surplus, but we were buying from market to supplement our home consumption food. But nowadays, instead of buying from market, we are taking to the market. Yeah.
Push-pull was presented as a sustainable and efficient agroecology technique in a 2008 United Nations report. Entitled Organic Agriculture and Food Security in Africa, it is based on 15 experiments in East Africa and concludes that agroecology can increase yield by at least 120% in a period of 3 to 10 years. After a reminder that the number of people suffering from hunger in sub-Saharan Africa has risen by 20% over the last 20 years, the UN experts encourage political decision makers, and I quote, to take a look at this promising production system with fresh eyes.
Organic agriculture is based on local knowledge and local resources and inputs. The word local is key, as is a concern for prevention and regeneration, meaning that production methods are created on a sustainable basis. This model of local development is very attractive for developing countries, as it is carried out at a lower cost. It can create local produce and local markets. It is a self-sufficient model, which pulls the whole economy up to a higher level.
Does that mean we should be actively and publicly supporting small-scale producers?
Absolutely. Experts believe we should assign small-scale farmers an entirely new role. But that would entail a radical transformation of agricultural policies, which is akin to a real farming revolution. Small-scale producers should be systematically supported. Even the World Bank, in a recent report, estimated that every dollar invested in agriculture produces $3 of economic activity, as opposed to just $1.5 or $2 for every dollar invested in the industrial sector.
Senegal's story is exemplary. Like many southern countries, this former French colony came under the control of the International Monetary Fund in the 1980s. Under the pretext of curbing its debt, the country was forced to implement what is termed a structural adjustment program. In the agricultural sector, this policy has led to favoring export crops, such as groundnut and greenhouse-grown vegetables that use vast quantities of irrigation. At the same time, the country was invaded by farming surplus from European countries, such as wheat and onions.
Bandu ko aduna lo wendo ko dessin aduna lo wendo hollir dudo faanu ngannen aduna ko jokkandir ko yimbe ber kon jokkandir dum non woni odo bim do eto gonne do eto Sénégal ko moƴnata ko solde men ko bonnata ko solde men fon jeya hen fam ummuto Europe Espagne France Allemagne Hollande ɓeɗon soble ummuto ga ngara ɗo gande ɗo noon e ga ujunaji kewɗi kilométre ngoni ma won hedde 5000 km
ɗum jiɗɗen ñaagaɗen to e dow soble garoɗe ɗe yeɓe nangan men ɗum enen ko ndenno ko bel ma wawi yaade so yihi bel ma wawi ko dañi ko nafma ɓesma andi sa liggim kadi mbasa besɗa kadi andi softa liggey
kono objectif men kam enen ko yalla yata ken wiye ko remoɓe Sénégal en mbawan Sénégal.
In 2006, at a time when Senegal's food dependency was constantly increasing, the government made a radical decision. It banned onion imports from February to July, which corresponds to the 6 months of national onion production. Along with rice, onions are the country's most consumed food. Ibrahim Sall is the father of 9 children. He grows tomatoes, rice, and okra on a plot of land on the banks of the river Senegal. But in this month of April, he focuses all his attention on his onion field, located further inland.
Le fait qu'on interdise l'importation des oignons.
The fact that they have forbidden onion imports makes us farmers very happy. If onions are not protected, a whole sector, including a whole chain of people who depend on that sector, will really suffer. My family helps me, but we cannot do everything. I have to take on extra people. For example, I hire seasonal workers who work here for 3 months. I pay them 60,000 francs to dig up a hectare of onions. Around here, the Fula people come and cut the onion flowers to give them to their cattle. We are currently in a very dry period, so this helps the animals to survive. There is no fresh grass around, but they manage to feed their animals with the onion flowers. If this sector did not exist, personally, I would not be here. When I was 20 or 25, I was seriously considering emigrating and doing other things. But agriculture, and in particular onion growing, gave me the confidence to believe I could do something here without going elsewhere. A lot of people leave, whereas if agriculture were well protected and given the resources it needs, everyone could live here without leaving the valley of the river Senegal.
The temporary ban on onion imports brought about a spectacular development of the onion sector. In 6 years, annual production has gone from 80,000 tons to 230,000 tons, and turnover has increased sevenfold. Ibrahim sells his farm gate production to a bana, an intermediary who transports the onions from the field to Dakar. Today, Ibrahim is not pleased, as the markets in the capital are saturated with onions and the price has collapsed. Ibrahim's problem is that onion production is seasonal, and he has no way to stock part of his harvest to be able to run his stocks down in keeping with demand. To be entirely efficient, the temporary ban on imports should be accompanied by the development of storage facilities.
If I don't sell the onions, I need to make provisional warehouses for them, or I move some of the stock under the trees. What else can I do? I'm convinced that if we had storehouses, we could satisfy the requirements of Senegal for 10 months of the year.
It is in particular to bring up the crucial problem of storehouses that Ibrahim and his colleague Usman have traveled to Dakar, where the largest agricultural fair in West Africa, the Fiara, is taking place.
That's organic. It's all organic.
For the 2012 edition of the fair, the FONGS, which numbers 31 farmers' organizations, has organized a debate entitled The Onion Sector and Food Sovereignty. The three key players in the sector are taking part: the producers, the traders, and the consumers. Facing them is the Market Regulation Agency representative. The agency, which was created in 2003, is in charge of controlling the onion import ban, whilst at the same time making sure prices do not get out of control. This system of dialogue is exemplary, as it is based on three basic pillars: protectionism, regulation, and consumer protection. Do you think the onion sector in Senegal is a model that could inspire other southern countries? And my second question is, how did the World Trade Organization react to this decision? Because according to WTO rules, couldn't they interpret it as an infringement to free trade?
Have other countries adopted these measures? For the time being in West Africa, no. We dared to do it. Perhaps the other countries have not yet dared. But in any case, the Conference of the Ministers of Agriculture recommended that the model be established among all countries of the sub-region. And I have visited 9 countries in the sub-region to share this model of regulation. Regarding the WTO, they did come to Senegal, and we had a personal meeting with them. They told us they could do nothing against us.
Between the producer and the market, there are a lot of intermediaries, and each takes their own share. it's the farmer who loses out. We must also discuss the problem of storehouses. The sector will not develop unless we help the peasants to sell and stock their onions.
As for the storehouses, we will take the necessary measures. As for the intermediaries, as you say, some have done next to no hard work or have invested nothing in the sector, and yet they grab the maximum profit margin. We are going to try and create a more equitable division of the profit margin so that everyone is satisfied.
The development of the onion sector can be done in a balanced way, so that the producer ends up with lucrative prices, so that the trader always gets a margin he's satisfied with, and so that the consumer benefits by consuming quality onions. If these different approaches are carried out, the onion sector will experience major developments.
One of the problems in recent years is that we've presumed that producers' interests and consumers' interests are opposed to each other. It was considered to be in the consumer's interest to have low prices and to have a mass distribution of standardized food products via increasingly developed distribution circuits. We opposed the interests of consumers to those of the producers, whom we thought would want prices to be high. So we thought we had to arbitrate between the interests of these two groups. So the question itself has been put the wrong way. The question we should be asking is, who's making profits from the way the food system is organized? When you ask that question, you realize that the producer's margin is becoming increasingly small, while the consumers are paying more and more, including when the producer's incomes are increasingly low. We need to work towards shorter chains, which enable both the consumer and the producer to earn within the food systems that link them closely to each other, that allow producers to be better paid for their work, and that allow consumers to have access to more affordable products.
With its 130 million inhabitants, Japan is one of the most dependent countries in the world regarding its food. It imports nearly 60% of the food it consumes, with the exception of rice, for which it is self-sufficient. Indeed, since the end of the Second World War, the government has supported the production of the population's staple crop by heavily taxing imports. As a result, there are rice paddies all over the archipelago, in the valleys, mountains, and even the cities. Like here in Ogawa, a city with a population of 40,000, located about 60 kilometers from Tokyo. This is where Yoshinori Kaneko lives. He's been practicing organic agriculture for 40 years. With one specificity, he is entirely self-sufficient for both his production resources and the sale of his produce. On his 3 hectares, Kaneko grows cereals and oil-producing plants, as well as a wide variety of fruit and vegetables.
I grow 60 different vegetables over the year, and about 100 different vegetal species. In Japanese, we call farmers hayakusho, which means he who cultivates 100 things. The consumers appreciate having lots of different vegetables. Agriculture is not like industry. If we only grew one type of crop, that would provoke disease and parasites. Food that constitutes life and health has nothing in common with industrial produce. Each vegetable is unique. 100 vegetables are 100 lives that I have been entrusted with.
Underlying every task that Kaneko carries out on his small farm is the same philosophy, which explains the incredible harmony that reigns here. Everything is treated with great care, the plants, the trees, and the animals, whose well-being is of utmost importance. Kaneko, who is descended from 10 generations of farmers, usually explains his approach using an anecdote. In the 1960s, when Japan was seeking to modernize its agriculture, his father started the intensive breeding of dairy cows, and for him, it was the start of his problems.
My father had 30 cows. Each cow produced 30 kilos of manure a day, so we had a ton of manure every day that we couldn't get rid of. What's more, the cows were in a very poor state of health, so I went back to the basics of breeding. I have 3 hectares of crops and rice paddies. If you consider the balance between the grasses, the fields, and the rice paddies, 3 cows is the right number, because I can feed them completely. The only thing I buy is salt.
Self-sufficiency is Kaneko's golden rule. Nothing goes to waste on his farm because everything is part of the life cycle. The waste produced on the farm is recycled to nourish the produce, functioning as a closed circuit, like the manure from the cows, which forms the basis for the compost. Vegetal waste, like the soy pulp, is mixed with animal or human excrement and fermented in a vat. The methane produced by the decomposing organic matter is collected and used as energy for cooking.
Organic agriculture does not contribute to global warming. It's a means of production that does not emit any greenhouse gases.
But that's not all. Kaneko is also self-sufficient for the energy supply of his farming equipment, as he makes his own fuel from used oils, which he purifies using a centrifuge. For 40 years, the farm's entire production has been delivered to 2 consumer groups based in Ogawa and Tokyo. They are known as teikei in Japan, which means partnership, and which today refers to a system of direct sales of organic farm produce.
Everything is organic.
The teikei movement was founded in 1971, at the same time as the Japanese Federation of Organic Farming, of which Kaneko was a founding member.
I work in partnership with 30 families of consumers. We have a very close relationship, like in a real family. And we share the same standards of quality. For these 30 families, there are no fixed prices for the vegetables. We offer them to them, and in exchange, we receive what we call a recognition, because we consider that food is not a product like any other. We have a very serene relationship, in which the issue of price is secondary.
In what economic and social context were the teikeis founded?
After the Second World War, Japan relied on industrialization for its reconstruction. With the help of the US, it tried to catch up with the level of the developed countries. In the 1960s, the country underwent vast economic development. And all over the country, diseases linked to pollution started appearing, like Minamata disease, which was caused by mercury pollution, Itai disease, caused by cadmium poisoning, and Yokkaichi asthma, caused by atmospheric pollution. Chemical residues were found in food, which raised concern among young urban mothers, who as a result sought a way to obtain healthy produce. They created organizations through which they contacted the farmers to ask them to produce organic food. This young mothers' movement was at the origin of the tekeis in the early 1970s.
Tomoko has not forgotten her first meeting with the young urban mothers who had never seen a farm in their lives. Today, the system runs smoothly. Food baskets are prepared twice a week according to the individual taste of the families that the Kanekos have been working with for nearly 20 years. That's one of the good things about the teikei. I've committed all my consumers' requirements to memory. I know that such and such a family likes one thing, or another family likes something else. If one family is very fond of cucumber, I put lots in their basket. If a family can't stand them, I give them something else instead. I more or less customize each basket.
Usually, when people talk about consumers and producers, they think of a relationship based on profit. One party wants to sell their vegetables for as much money as possible. The other party wants to buy them as cheaply as possible. That's a rather conflictual relationship. In the tekeis, it's different. The producers and the consumers work together so that agriculture can continue under the best possible conditions and produce healthy food that benefits all. Importantly, in this relationship, the people forge ties. It's more than just a buying and selling of produce. That's the principle of the teikei.
It's the Kanekos.
これが先週お渡しする白里材料。あ、そうです。はい。ありがとうございます。すいません。いつもありがとうございます。子供が生まれた時に
I didn't want to feed my baby vegetables that had chemical residues in them.
させたくないなって思ったんですね。なぜっていうとやっぱり
I think that's very unhealthy.
体に悪いんじゃないかっていうふうに思ったのと、で実際食べてみたら
The Kanekos vegetables are very good. That's why I continue to get my supplies from them.
Did you know that this system of teikeis has started to take off all over the world?
No, I didn't know that. It's a very reassuring system because you see the producers in person and you know the condition of their fields.
The teikei system has really taken off. For example, in the United States, with the CSA, or Community Supported Agriculture System, that was created in 1985. In France, the first AMAP, the Association for the Maintenance of Family Farming, was created in 2001, before spreading throughout the country. Kaneko is often called upon to share his experience. Meanwhile, he continues to innovate. For a few years now, he has been working with new sustainable and organic partners who have the job of preparing the rice paddy before transplanting the rice.
These are adult ducks that I release about 10 days before the rice is transplanted so that they prepare the rice paddy. They eat the weeds and insects, turn over the earth, and move the water around. It stops the weeds growing, and what's more, they produce natural fertilizer. Then in the autumn, we have the rice and the duck to eat. In Japan, we say the duck is a bird of 10,000 treasures.
So in fact, the ducks work for you.
Yes, they are like my mother. I actually find it hard to eat them.
The Kanekos could not have children, and yet they have a big family. All meals are shared with a crop manager, but also with the endless stream of Japanese and international interns that have been coming to the farm over the last 30 years. Some are students, others have retired, but they all intend to start organic farming, following the teachings of the man they consider to be their master.
I came to Kaneko not only because he is self-sufficient for his food, but also self-sufficient for his energy.
Here, all the vegetables are good. My vegetables are good too, so I can make an honest comparison. His vegetables are better than mine.
Does everything on the table come from the farm?
Yes, everything except the fish. There aren't any fish in Saitama Prefecture.
Do you think organic farming could feed Japan?
Yes, I think so. The state and the experts say it's impossible, but my own experience shows it is possible. The model I follow is 2 hectares of crops and rice to meet all the food needs of 10 families. If you divide 2 hectares by 10 families, each family needs 20 hours to be fed. In Japan, each member of the population has the equivalent of 4 available hours on average. So a family of 5 can be entirely self-sufficient. If we base our reasoning on the surface area that is currently farmed, the country can feed itself.
Every year on June 10th, Kaneko organizes what he calls the Sake Festival, in homage to the ancestral wine produced by fermenting rice. The members of the teikes are invited, as are neighbors, cousins, friends, and all those who want to renew ties with Mother Earth by learning to transplant rice saplings. Along with corn and wheat, rice is the world's most consumed cereal. Seeing these men, women, and children from the city coming to help Kaneko, the organic farmer, to sow the rice paddy that will feed them, I thought back to the comments I'd heard a year earlier while taking part in a French television program, which maintained that we could not feed the world without pesticides. And I thought to myself, it is precisely those pesticides, as well as the agronomic and economic model they represent, that is starving the world.
I can categorically say that feeding 9 billion people in 2050, perhaps even more people than that as forecast, with a pesticide-free agriculture is totally possible. I'm convinced of that, but it requires knowledge. It involves an agriculture that will avoid monocropping, which will avoid putting just the one variety of crop in a single field. It is a knowledge-based agriculture in which several varieties will be combined in the same field and which can resist various categories of pathogenic agents and insects.
What do those who claim we can't feed the world without pesticides base their reasoning on?
I think the argument that we cannot produce enough to feed the world without pesticides is the position of the agrochemical industry, and it serves their own interests.
So we need a real agricultural revolution?
Absolutely, in all senses of the term, both a technical revolution, a shift from industrial processes and standard produce to a form of agriculture that is more homemade and respects the environment more, and also, let's face it, a cultural revolution for farmers, so that they realized that when they were told to be modern, well, that wasn't quite so modern. They must realize that tomorrow's modern agriculture will respect bees, aphids, ladybirds and beetles. Farmers shouldn't lose hope. Politically, we need to win a fight, and to win it, we must be united. Consumers, environmentalists and farmers, all united towards an agriculture that serves the public interest.